let's begin the panel. The panel that I know many of you have been waiting for, our round table. A few notes up top. Oh, by the way, just to let you know, I'm Adam Tyson. I'm a PhD candidate here in the Religious Studies program. Been studying with Dr. Singh, although my specialty area is Islamic mysticism and philosophy. It's been a delight and a privilege to explore some commonalities and common ground between Sikhi and Sufism. Also, my gratitude for allowing me, an adjacent or non-expert, to join you, because I learned a lot from the Sikh Studies Conference last year and this year as well. And I hope to bring that increased religious literacy into all my classes going forward. So thank you. A few notes about our panel. Because it is 5 people and in the interest of time and maintaining a fairly equitable time distribution, I will let you know when we're at about the 15-minute mark. As I mentioned, you can have between 15 and 20 minutes. If you want to take the full 20 minutes, absolutely. But I will send you a message at about 15 minutes just to let you know where we're at for time. And importantly, we will, before we open up to general Q&A, we will have an interpanel discussion, which I'm looking forward to. So please do remind me, panelists, if I forget to do that, make sure that we do get you an interpanel discussion first before we open up to general Q&A. For the audience, for attendees, as always, you can place questions in the Q&A, and for panelists, feel free to respond to the questions in the Q&A at your leisure. And we can get to them and have further discussion, even if it's a question that you've answered. If you still want to talk a bit more about it, we can certainly do that. So when we do open for general Q&A, I'll allow you to choose whichever question you prefer to answer. So without further ado, Arvind-Pal Mandair teaches at the University of Michigan. His current books include Spiritual Warriors, Interrogating Logics of Nonviolence in Sikhism, forthcoming from Cambridge University Press this year. Sikh Philosophy from Bloomsbury Press, forthcoming next year. And Geophilosophical Encounters, Decolonial Praxis, Diasporic Logics, and Sikh Thought, forthcoming from Routledge next year. Apologies for the confusion. Please, the virtual podium is yours. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Great. Well, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. My thanks to Professor Bashara Singh and to the organizing team for allowing us to contribute to this panel. Also, a quick apology, I don't have a formal paper, but what I'm going to offer in about 15 minutes or hopefully less is a set of opening remarks, which are not entirely fleshed out. And they may even seem a little bit disjointed. Most of them are handwritten notes at the moment. But I hope that they'll provide some conceptual signposting, which my fellow panelists can choose to engage with or not engage with from their own areas of specialization. Just to remind you, the central and connecting theme of the panel was to reassess and interrogate the role of the critical or critical thought in Sikh studies, and perhaps also to think about positionality within the broader knowledge system, of which Sikh studies is a tiny part. And I guess a more strategic objective might be, and if I can use a boxing analogy here, is to enable Sikh studies to punch a little heavier than its assigned weight class within the humanities and social sciences. So given that one of the aims of this conference is for scholarly practitioners to reflect on the state of Sikh studies as a field, it's helpful to recall the past attempts, conferences and volumes that have attempted to do this. And one thinks, and I thank Shinda for laying some of the conferences out earlier on, but one thinks here of the Berkeley conference in 1976, which in a sense started the whole Sikh studies scene, especially in North America. And the volume that came out of that was Sikh studies Comparative Perspectives on a Changing Tradition by Jerry Barrier and Mark Juergensmeyer. A decade later, we have the conference in Toronto. I think it was 87 or 88, and I think Lou Fennick would probably know better, Pashara Singh also, because you might have been at that conference, organized by Hugh MacLeod, Milton Israel, Joseph T. O'Connell, and Professor Guriqbal. And then a little later, a conference at Columbia University, 1990 or 91, which produced the volume Studying the Sikhs, produced by Gurinder Mann and Jack Hawley. And this was followed by conferences at Michigan in 1994 and a couple of others after that. And then an important conference at SOAS in 1998. Now, what's interesting about all of these earlier conferences, although they really did set Sikh studies on the map, is that the function of critical thought, or the standpoint of critique, never really moved away from the classic Enlightenment ideal of disinterested, impartial, neutral observation, and a kind of a knowledge system based around that, around the separation of the knower and the known. And it's interesting that, you know, a good example of an enunciation of this Enlightenment ideal can be found in Hugh MacLeod's 1994 paper, where Cries of Outrage, which most of you have read, where he was, in a sense, answering back to criticism from the Sikh community from different quarters. And that's one of the very rare occasions when we see somebody trying to grapple with the epistemic machinery of the field that we're working in and the broader knowledge system. Now, the separation of the knower and the known is designed, in a sense, to take the gaze of scholars away from the subject position itself, from the knowing self. And it's to challenge that, precisely that standpoint, that Sikh Formation started with an editorial in 2005 called The Subject of Sikh Studies. The point was to signal a shift from studying Sikhs, which is fine in itself, to the problems caused by subjectivity and positionality, and to signal that something else may be happening here. Nevertheless, the outcomes of the work of early scholars has been very positive. We see a diversification of the field over 30 years or so. Personnel changes where we see scholars who were originally sort of white male moving to women of color, and then across disciplines as well. The disciplinary study of scripture, history, philology, which are often connected with a notion of Orientalism, gives way to anthropology, broader studies in area studies, and then I would say in the late 90s and the beginning of the 20th century, are really a full-fledged multidisciplinarity or an interdisciplinarity. The field is really developing strongly as we speak. But despite the ongoing evolution and sporadic attempts to take stock of the field, a certain shadow of Orientalism, nativism, Occidentalism, and I conflate all three of these categories, continues to haunt Sikh studies in less obvious ways, such that the field continues to be framed in a way that perpetuates an epistemic inequality or an epistemic injustice that's intrinsic to the architecture of the knowledge system per se. And this epistemic inequity or injustice lingers not despite, but arguably, or ironically, I should say, because of the very progressivism that has pushed the field forward. A progressivism that has been unable so far to divest itself of what Rosie Braidotti calls a methodological nationalism, the methodological nationalism of the knowledge system. So from this perspective, even ostensibly progressive critical movements like post-colonial studies, critical theory, philosophy are as much a part of the problem rather than a solution to it. And the problem, to use the words of the political philosopher Charles Mills, is, I quote, the normative dimension of epistemology, close quote. The normative dimension of epistemology, according to which the knowledge system is organized. This normative epistemology is premised on the peculiarity of modern notions of the knowing self and of a particular dogmatic image of thought as representation. So to apply this to my own area of research, to Sikh philosophy, I'm kind of involved and have been involved in a tussle between the bare recognition of Sikh philosophy as a philosophy within the broader field of philosophy, which is very, very conservative. And there have been a lot of debates in the last 5 years, which have kind of looked at the epistemic underpinnings of philosophy as such. And a lot of this seeps into all of the other disciplines as well. So just to apply this normative dimension of epistemology in turn determines the nature of the playing field, what you might call the arena of thought upon which concepts of one culture, in this case the Sikh, are allowed to encounter or interact with Western concepts. And this playing field's normativity is grounded on a fundamental denial of the self-contradictory nature of this epistemology. In fact, it's this very denial that reveals the truth of this epistemology itself, where it becomes a touchstone for scientific criteria in general. Now, the epistemology as such stipulates that the knowing self should remain distant, untouched by the phenomena or entities or facts that it encounters. But the real truth is that the knowing self is also always deeply embedded in the world, in local histories, in social and cultural contexts. Therefore, knowledge is always generated in specific social contexts. And so to properly count as academic knowledge, anybody doing Sikh studies must implicitly acknowledge the rules of this epistemic machinery, which means that you must first acknowledge the dominance and supremacy of the Western colonial supremacist epistemology, because it's this epistemology that measures the validity of knowledge about Sikhs, Sikh concepts, communities, their memories, and notions of time, amongst many other things. So what I'm proposing is not just a turn back to the gaze, to turn back the gaze on the knowledge system itself. This is precisely what post-colonial studies, subaltern studies have tried to do, and in part pretty successfully. But rather what I want to do, and for Sikh studies practitioners, is to take ownership of the epistemic machinery in a way that Jewish thinkers, for example, have been doing for a very long time, to try and learn how to reorganize the architecture of the knowledge system itself, to drive the machine so that we can truly create alternative futures for Sikh studies. A kind of Sikh studies that's capable of directly interrogating its epistemic architecture rather than being segregated according to area or religion or other designations. Truly create alternative futures for Sikh studies rather than the model kept in place by the liberal Anglo-Euro-American theoretical paradigm, which governs the knowledge system per se through what Deleuze has called a dogmatic image of thought, the centrality of the knowing self and the idea that thought is just purely representation. And the way to do that is to cultivate, the way to kind of question this whole paradigm is to cultivate a very different standpoint for thought itself, for critical reflection, for the knowing self. And I don't have time to delve into this in detail. I've explored it in my forthcoming book, Geophilosophical Encounters. But I'm taking a leaf out of Henry Rosemont's early work, where he in his work on Chinese philosophy, points to a different kind of epistemology, something he calls relational knowing, which in turn produces a relational self or a relational knower, one that's connected to the very world in which knowledge is produced. And that, in a sense, might be an indication of a kind of post-Western perspective, where non-Western cultures can begin to re-engineer the architecture of the humanities away from its original sort of Eurocentric premises. In my own work, I've kind of developed this using the idea of diaspora, where I don't treat the idea of diaspora in the conventional sense, but probe the idea of diaspora as a concept. So I look at, for example, my own positionality, not just as a Sikh, but as British, as Indian, as Punjabi, American now for the last 20 years, whatever else there is, and use the multiplicity of that self to re-engineer what we might call a relational or knowing self that's relational. Now, this search for a relational sense, a post-Western sense of the critical, is being undertaken in different fields. Jewish studies is just one of them, and it has done that very, very successfully. You can see that by the number of critical thinkers, philosophers who are themselves Jewish, and some not counting themselves as Jewish as such, but nevertheless, Jewish studies has had a major impact into the humanities itself, into the social sciences, into restructuring it. African studies is another area that's looking at this in very interesting ways. But the one that I'm particularly drawn to is critical Muslim studies, which in a sense in the last 20 years has been a reaction to the Islamophobia of the past 2 or 3 decades and the positioning of Muslims within the knowledge systems. And the other area that's really looking at this in a major way is world philosophies, which is a really burgeoning area of research at this moment. So this search is being undertaken in different fields, and it's being driven by external political factors which affect Sikhs and Sikh studies even more acutely than Jews and Muslims. And that's possibly because of the positioning of these two constituencies, Sikhs and Sikh studies, in an even more precarious manner than that of Jews and Muslims. And I'm specifically referring to the changing nature of the geopolitical field as exemplified by recent challenges to the liberal world order and the liberal intellectual paradigm. One only has to look at what Trump has done in the last 4 years, and before that, Brexit and Hindutva. And I could multiply those examples quite easily, where things like race, caste, religious nationalism have all sort of come to the forefront. Although it needs to be said that these challenges to the liberal order have also laid bare the kind of supremacist conceptual ordering of the world, the European supremacy in the conceptual ordering of the world in a way that wasn't quite so obvious, or we weren't allowed to kind of acknowledge before that. So in other words, if the geopolitical order of the last 200 years has maintained its hegemony vis-a-vis global epistemology, and if this global epistemology is ingrained in the architecture or the blueprint of the modern university, and its ordering and policing of disciplines, of areas, of fields of knowledge, especially about non-Western cultures, then the task before us, as we reflect on the future of Sikh studies, is nothing less than to take sovereignty back from the knowledge system. And yes, you didn't hear me incorrectly. The contemporary geopolitical order has held sway not only through the function of political sovereignty, the sovereignty of the nation state model, but through what the scholar of Islamic studies, Wael Halak, called epistemic sovereignty. Indeed, the trend that I'm seeing in current waves of critical Muslim studies and world philosophies is this urgent desire to wrest epistemic sovereignty from the Occidentalist, Orientalist machine and take it back to the various constituencies. So for Sikhs and Sikh studies, the need to assert a certain degree of epistemic sovereignty is likely to become more urgent in the near future because of multiple threats that are appearing. And I've mentioned race and the resurgence of white supremacy, but the obvious one is obviously Hindutva, any number of listservs where RSS members are kind of constantly engaging Sikhs in the hope of kind of breaking breaking down the paradigms in which they've been working. The farmers' protest is another example that has called for some urgency to this, to looking at this. And the other example I would say is the Indian government's interest in creating Sikh chairs, which is a clear attempt to control the narrative of Sikhism and Sikh studies. And some of this stuff I've discussed in geophilosophical encounters, so I won't sort of go on about it here, but I think my fellow panelists will be able to broaden some of these areas of thought a little bit. So thank you for that. I hope that was within 15 minutes.
That was perfect, Dr. Mandair. Thank you so much. And with apologies again for the slight confusion up at the top. Now, hopefully correctly announcing you at the right time, Dr. Anneeth Hundle is Assistant Professor of Anthropology and on Kaur Sahota, Presidential Chair of Sikh Studies at UC Irvine, where she's associated faculty with the Religious Studies program, the Department of Asian American Studies, the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies. Prior to her current position, she was a visiting professor at UC Berkeley, an assistant professor at UC Merced, and a research assistant at the Makerere Institute of Social Research at Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda. And apologies if I've butchered that pronunciation, I'm sorry. In addition to her first book project, Insecurities of Expulsion, Afro-Asian Relationalities, Citizenship Formations, and Racial Uganda, she is published in several peer-reviewed journals and popular publications on issues related to Sikh studies and global diasporas, South Asian diaspora communities, and citizenship practices in East Africa, university studies, and transnational and global South feminisms. She is currently associate editor of the journal Sikh Formations, Religion, Culture, Theory. Thank you so much. Please, the electronic podium is yours, as they say.
Thank you so much, Adam, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Arvind, for putting together this panel. And I just really appreciate your thoughts on epistemic sovereignty. So I think my reflections will be a really nice supplement to what you've already mentioned. So in light of the conference and the panel theme, I want to offer some points on what I'm seeing as the relationship between the contemporary discipline of anthropology and anthropology departments in the US Academy and Sikh studies, particularly in the US. So in order for me to develop Sikh studies within a top-rated anthropology department at UCI, I have found that I've had to do a lot of space clearing to be able to do that. And it's been a challenging but interesting project and something that I'm still working through and will be for some time. So some of the larger questions that motivate me in my work are the following. I want to offer a preliminary schematic of the mutual relationship between the history of the discipline of anthropology and the history of Sikh studies as an interdisciplinary field formation. What current and critical innovations in the discipline of anthropology lend themselves to a Sikh studies interdiscipline? And here I'm using Rod Ferguson's term interdiscipline. I can discuss a little bit more about what I mean by that term later on. So this interdiscipline has to contend with the challenges of 21st century formations of empire, the state and capital, race, religion, caste, gender and sexuality, and other social categories, and the US Academy today. Likewise, how might Sikh studies help to influence the field of anthropology as it continues to grapple with its normative constructions of cultural difference, otherness, or alterity? Finally, what is the signature method of anthropologists, typically ethnography, offer the field of Sikh studies in terms of understanding the lived experience of Sikhs and Sikhi as a tradition? What kind of object of study is being constituted in anthropology today? And what might be the limitations of ethnography as a method as well? So within Sikh studies, we often presume that we already know what anthropology is and what the precise relationship of anthropology to Sikh studies is. Certainly, there's been a sustained critique of anthropology by post-colonial scholars who have pointed to the discipline's status as the handmaid to colonialism and central to knowledge formations that consolidated imperial and colonial projects, as well as translated indigenous forms of knowledge and ways of life through the violence of colonial discourse, especially through the invention of tradition and custom. And that's very salient for Sikhs, of course. Yet, despite its Western colonial origins and arguably ongoing complicities in imperialist projects, anthropology is still one of the only disciplines in the US Academy that overtly presents itself as a site for the study of cultural difference. Thus, it still attracts a number of non-Western, racial, religious minority students. And moreover, it has been post-colonial scholars and scholars of color who have been on the front lines of what I call decolonizing anthropology from within. Thus, although anthropology departments remain very fraught spaces, we cannot presume to definitively know what anthropology is, and we must acknowledge that the discipline continues to be shaped by sustained critique, especially by its so-called native intellectuals. And I think I'm seeing this definitely in the past few years that I've been at UCI, that anthropology continues to be a key discipline for recruiting Sikh studies students as well, and future PhDs. I want to suggest that there have been three major lines of critique within anthropology, all with their own complex intellectual histories. So 3 lines of internal critique within the discipline. And I think these 3 lines of critique are very salient for the future of Sikh studies. These 3 intellectual histories within the discipline are concerned with the categories of 1, culture, 2, race, and 3, religion. And I suggest that all 3 of these critiques from within, alongside the huge demographic shifts that we're seeing in the discipline, position anthropology to be an important site of radical critique, liberatory politics, and envisioning and practicing a post-liberal humanist global order. So I think of this as an anthropology and a Sikh studies of the contemporary, but also of the future. And that's how I sort of am envisioning these unfolding field formations. So I want to say just a little bit about these 3 lines of critique, and I'll point to some key texts along the way that have helped me to think about this. Number 1, the question of culture. There's been a sustained critique of the modern culture concept within anthropology. We moved from a kind of essentialist culture concept, as if culture is something that exists out there in an essentialist, holistic sort of way, to thinking more about culture as a combination of context and history embedded within power relations. And in doing so, we've refigured the symbolic apparatus and logic of the discipline itself. And here there are many scholars and texts I can point to who have dealt with the culture question in anthropology. I'm just going to focus here on the anthropologist Michel Rolfe-Triot. He's a Haitian Caribbean anthropologist. And I've especially been influenced by his volume, Global Transformations, Anthropology in the Modern World, which was published in 2003. I don't know if some of you are watching Raoul Peck's Exterminate All the Brutes on HBO right now. It's a really fantastic documentary series on basically the history of white supremacy and genocide in the US, Africa, the Caribbean, et cetera. But Trio is mentioned in this series, so I would suggest checking it out if you have time. So in his essay, Anthropology and the Savage Slot, Trio suggests that the current critique of representation in anthropology, representation of the other, doesn't address anthropology's relationship to the geography of imagination of the West, nor the question of the so-called savage slot, i.e. the ontological positioning of the Western anthropologist studying the native other. Anthropology, he suggests, belongs to a discursive field that is an inherent part of the West's geography of imagination, and a critique of anthropology requires a historicization of that larger discursive field, and thus an exploration of the relations between anthropology and the geography of imagination that is indispensable to the West's construction of itself. And of course, like these categories of West and non-West might feel outdated now, so we can think about the global North and South, et cetera. But I think the point regarding these Western epistemological and ontological formations remain consistent. So his main point is that anthropology's future depends largely on its ability to contest the slot and the thematic that constructs this idea of the native or the savage. And thus the direction of the discipline depends upon an explicit attack on the slot itself and the symbolic order upon which it is premised. He also provides a method. He suggests we can capture domains of significance by creating strategic points of reentry into the discourse of otherness. And there are areas within the discourse where the production of new voices or new combinations of meaning can perturb the entire field and open the way to its partial recapture, which I think is really exciting as a mission or motivation of anthropology moving forward. Secondly, the critique around the category of race. Again, race is tied to all these discussions within anthropology around culture. And we can say that the modern Americanist anthropological conceptions of race, culture, and language gave way actually to these three major subfields in Americanist biological anthropology, cultural anthropology, linguistic anthropology. Again, there's many texts and thinkers to work with here, but I really like Kamala Visweswaran's essay, Race and the Culture of Anthropology. She mentions that there's two important intellectual legacies in anthro that we need to think about. One is an intellectual legacy of Franz Boas, the second, W.E.B. Du Bois. She argues that the mainstream conception of race in anthropology is problematic because it argues that it is a social construction and has no scientific reality, and therefore anthropology lapsed into a kind of cultural relativism and celebration of difference with no strong critique of anti-racism. No anti-racism embedded within it. She also argues that Franz Boas, the father of American anthropology, sought to differentiate race from racism and thus ceded to race to biological anthropology such that culture became everything race was not. And because culture came to replace the study of race, anthropology could never be the vanguard of studying how race and racism work as social processes, nor a site of anti-racist practice. Du Bois, on the other hand, understood the cultural contours of race and asserted that the category of race was created through racial discrimination. We now see in anthropology, now finally, a really sort of important surge and uptake of critical race theory, including studies of racialization and racial formation. And there's new volumes on the anthropology of white supremacy and the anthropology of race and racism that are emerging. Again, the vanguard here is generally scholars of color within anthropology. I want to argue that it's not possible to do Sikh studies in the Western Academy without a clear understanding of the production of Sikhs as other and as a racial project. Sikh studies must encompass the study of racial formation and racialization. We cannot just locate the study of Sikhs within a sort of comparative religious studies framework in isolation of the study of race. And I think we've seen a lot of movement on this with thinking about race in relation to religion and caste. And so this is an exciting development in the academy. And then my last point, and then I'll end very, very quickly, is the third strain of critique in anthropology has been, like culture, critiquing an essentialist concept of religion. And here I take my cue, of course, from Bilal Assad's work. In his essay, Anthropology of Islam, he queries this project and argues that we have to understand Islam as a discursive tradition. Anthropologists need to rethink what their object of study is, and the notion of tradition can assist us with this task. He argues there's no coherent anthropology of Islam can be founded on the notion of a determinate social blueprint or on the idea of an integrated social totality in which social structure and religious ideology interact. Most anthropologists of Islam have defined their scope too broadly, both those appealing to an essentialist position and those appealing to a nominalist one. If one wants to write an anthropology of Islam, one should begin, as Muslims do, from the concept of a discursive tradition that includes and is relating itself to the founding texts, the Quran and the Hadith, in relation to Islam. Islam is neither a distinctive social structure nor a heterogeneous collection of beliefs, customs, and morals. It is a tradition. And again, here I think there's lessons for Sikh studies. Obviously, I think we are in Sikh studies working with the categories of tradition or the vernacular, and we've been influenced by Dalal Assad's work. And I think moving forward for me, I'm querying the need for an anthropology of Sikhism. Like, is that something that we really need? Can we just think about Sikh tradition unfolding in relationship to context and power and sort of lose some of the kind of essentialist baggage that has come with the normative concept of religion? So to end, I want to suggest that a starting point for a decolonized anthropology is one that strongly queries categories of culture, race, and religion. And that must be the starting point for our Sikh studies moving forward, for a critical Sikh studies project of the contemporary and the future, and for a decolonized Sikh studies project. And then I can talk more about what we've been doing here at UCI later on, but I will pass over the mic to the next person now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hundle. I'll introduce the next speaker. Dr. G.S. Sahota teaches in the literature department at UC Santa Cruz, where he holds the Aurora Chair in Sikh and Punjabi Studies. He is the author of Late Colonial Sublime, Neo-Epics and the End of Romanticism, published by Northwestern in 2018, and serves on the editorial board of Sikh Formations, where some of his recent work has appeared. With forthcoming work to be published in Boundary 2 and other journals, his research currently revolves around a critique of identity in the guise of a literary history of the Indo-German connection and some preliminary work on early Sikhism. His scholarship extends across diverse fields in the humanities and social sciences, and he has training in and has in turn taught a number of languages, including Sanskrit, Hindi, Urdu, French, and Punjabi, as well as photography, which he is now bringing to bear on a project to visually document the Gurdwaras of California. Thank you so much. The virtual podium is yours.
All right, thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers of the conference as well as the panel. Happy to be here. And hopefully I'll have a chance to meet some of you who have seen various webinars over the last few weeks, meet you in person on future occasions. It's very nice to be among such a learned crowd. I think there are more degrees among all of you than on a thermometer, so that's something I'm very happy about, to share my work with such a august crowd of people, august audience, I should say. Let me put some of this in context. The reason I mention all those languages is because this talk revolves around philology. And I think if there's a title, it was actually a formal talk, and if I'd written something, it would be something along the lines of a philology of another future, revisiting Ernst Trump and German Orientalism. And that sort of reference to Nietzsche's Zukunftsphilologie, and this would be another kind of take on that, maybe pressing beyond the boundaries of what Nietzsche could have imagined. And what I'm hoping is that this would be something like a pathway towards maybe a futural Sikh studies, in keeping with some of the points that have already been made, but one that would try to sort of reach back and recapture moments of missed opportunity, and think about that past in a way to sort of take cues from it for a distinct praxis, one that would sort of redeem those lost moments. So that's the general sense that I have going into this. It seems as if there's been a kind of stasis, despite all the talk of a future. There's a kind of stasis, and there may be sort of aborted futures. And maybe the only way to account for that or to get beyond it is to think about praxis. Praxis, and it's really wide-ranging connotations. And so some of this I have gathered from looking back at an essay written by Harry Harutunian in a book called Learning Places, The Afterlives of Area Studies. And the essay is called Postcoloniality's Unconscious Area Studies Desire. And he actually tries to think about sort of missed opportunities and how various fields didn't really register or weren't able to take on some of the challenges of, say, Said's Orientalism and the critique of Orientalism. And one of those areas is area studies itself. And so that's something that I think is worth maybe going back to. So Said's critique, according to Harutunian, really ended up in English studies, in the field of the departments of English, and area studies seemed to sort of push back against it. And this really prevented area studies from grappling with critical theory in ways that would have maybe pushed it beyond some of the paradigms that it had incorporated, and which had sort of given it foundational status. And so some of those, I think, missed opportunities would revolve around something like a rethinking of critical theory to overcome, right, the Cold War conditions of area studies possibility. And it would allow for maybe thinking of area studies beyond just a kind of language station where people just kind of come in, park and fill up with a language and then go off, and that's thought to be sort of adequate for what the knowledge would be that is created by area studies. And there were fears along these lines even when I was in an area studies program at the University of Chicago. And so I thought that these are really interesting maybe moments to go back to think about other sorts of possibilities in our own moment. And I think what this would maybe allow for, if we were to sort of take up a kind of critical theory, is the opportunity to break critical theory out of its Eurocentric mold. So that just seems really kind of straightforward, but perhaps it's worth pointing out in a simple way. And what this would, I think, amount to is examining the conditioning of bodies of knowledge by imperialism and capitalism, and also rethinking the kind of universality that is sort of presumed by these paradigms that we've adopted, or that are sort of already still in place within critical theory. And so there are other missed opportunities that I'm dealing with as well. And one involves the major lacuna in Said's Orientalism, the lacuna of German Orientalism. So this seems to be really missing, and it's a really interesting kind of gap in the work, and something which has not really been fully accounted for as of yet, despite various attempts. And I think there's something about German Orientalism that defies Said's general take on Orientalism and the kinds of paradigms, structures that he thinks of as fundamental, central to the project of Orientalism. So rather than a kind of question of difference, it seems as if German Orientalism actually thought in terms of identity and identification. And so there was a kind of identification with the East. There was even a belief in early German Romanticism that the German people originated in Kashmir, for instance, or way out in the East somewhere. And so there's this idea of the Urheimat Asians, right? The Asian sort of original homeland, the German people. And I think this accounts for various developments that follow in the 19th century. You have Goethe's, Hafez, or Schopenhauer's Indian sages. You have Nietzsche's Zarathustra. And then later, with a figure like Zimmer, I don't like to put Heinrich Zimmer in this category since he's sort of a category unto himself, but Zimmer's Shakti or Durga, and the mother goddess that he really sort of, in many ways, identifies with. And so this very distinct kind of orientation of German Orientalism leads to a lot of problems, because sometimes the identities that are forged are replete with all sorts of misrecognitions. And so this brings me to the case of Ernst Trump. And in these recent times with the pandemic, I haven't been able to go to a library, but this has opened up other sorts of opportunities to searching around on the internet. And I've been able to find these very interesting primary sources, including the funeral oration or Grabrede of Ernst Trump on 8th of April, 1885. And there's a lot of sort of fantasy, you could say, in this funeral oration around this figure. But I think it's a primary source, and it really opens up a kind of distinct, view into what the image was of the Orientalist, in this late 19th century moment. You guys all know that he took 4 trips to India. The third focused on research on Pashto as a language. And he did a lot of Protestant evangelical missionary work among the natives of that region on the borderlands, of Afghanistan. And there's a lot of fantasy there about a lot of tears being, shed as Trump makes his way back to Germany, among the people that he had converted. So you get that sort of fantasy image of what the role of the Orientalist was as sort of a savior, provides proper salvation and proper knowledge of the languages of these people for the broader world, maybe even for themselves. So that's the kind of, paternalistic image that you get in this Grabrede. But the 4th trip is the one that was sponsored by the British colonial government, and it brought Ernst Trump into an engagement with Sikh scripture. And he writes here, a lot of works in the wake of this. So not a tremendous amount of research has been done, because there seems to be a kind of mismatch between German, Punjabi studies, South Asian studies in general. But yet this, I think, is something maybe it's worth looking into in more detail. And some of this has been kind of done, but not with the kind of philological attention that I think it was really needed to sort of overcome some of the legacies here. So there are a few works that he wrote in the wake of doing this translation work of the Adi Granth. And one is, Die Religion der Sikhs, and this is 1881. And the first paragraph of the first chapter actually draws a comparison between Luther and Nanak and the rise of Sikhism with Reformation. And so right there, I think there's a really interesting kind of identity that is replete with all sorts of problematics. And we might begin to think, what were the sorts of philological, common sense that went into the making of that sort of identity, and whether that sort of is the, ur-problem of the kind of philology that we might want to do as a kind of critical corrective to some of what followed in the wake of this. And there are other works that he wrote, and he uses the term Stifter for Nanak. And this term is thought to be, is translated as founder, but also donator. And I think there's an interesting kind of ambiguity in this term Stifter that we might he always thinks of it as founder, and yet there could be other connotations that are probably even more useful to bring out from even Trump's language here. And so I've been trying to work through some of this to figure out how to reinterpret the role of Nanak against the grain of this Lutheran reading. that would be something maybe worth examining. And what the implications were, I think, for someone like Trump in this era was that he sort of thought of this there's a kind of hyper valuation of the founder figure, but a dismissal of the people who were taken by the message. And there's a displacement of the Panth. And he actually downgrades the people who sort of, he sees them all as sort of, in a sense, bad followers of the message of the founder. And so this, I think, provides us with a challenge, which is to think what would be a kind of critical philology that would perhaps work against the lines of this kind of Orientalist philology. So it's a task to rethink maybe what a different kind of philology would be. And this is something, you know, we can maybe further elaborate upon or discuss in common. But one thing that that occurs to me is, very simply put, a critical philology would have to sort of muster the reading and translation skills that would be able to counter some of these Orientalist legacies and maybe even track them down, sort of see what the implications were of the Orientalist philology to figure out what the kind of critical counter thread would be to act as a kind of corrective. And it would be a challenge that, you know, would try in some sense to reestablish and reground these texts in a much more responsible way. So responsible in a whole variety of contexts. And this is something that I've taken from Edward Said's very late work on the return to philology. And there's, I think, a few points that he makes that are fairly relevant to this task of a kind of critical philology. First of all, he talks about a kind of humanistic resistance, and he talks about sort of displacing the Eurocentric norms of Orientalist philology by looking at, say, different traditions of working with language, interpretation. For him, this involves, you know, kind of engagement with the Quran and with the traditions of Quranic scholarship that precedes European imperialism. Maybe there are certain sorts of cues available in the Indian tradition along those lines that have yet to be really sort of worked through. And I could say a couple of other things to maybe give some further perhaps grounding to this, this kind of contrapuntal philology that I have in mind. And one, maybe a few points. It would seek to put these texts, Adi Granth and so forth, maybe even Janam Sakhis, things that are beyond sort of just simply the sacral realm, into a kind of proper epistemic place. And, you know, this sort of in that kind of keeping with that idea that Arvind conveyed regarding a kind of epistemological sovereignty, the regaining of such. And here that would be, I think, made possible through a conversation with distinct communities with a different kind of history than this Orientalist one, and with a wider humanistic commitment to future possibilities. So in other words, not thinking that the humanistic enterprise has been exhausted by this very kind of restrictive moment exemplified by Orientalism. And this kind of humanistic resistance in the form of philology would mark a transition from one area of study into another. It would sort of take things from one realm into another. And that would be the sort of, you know, almost like the critical effort endpoint to take it in some sense out of area studies, outside of the fields that are maybe too restrictive for this operation in the current moment. And it would probably in some ways be about reestablishing legitimate authority. And I think that's what was perhaps taken away. And that was purposefully, you know, the case with a figure like Ernst Trump. And I think I'm running out of time, but I'll just conclude with a few lines from Said himself from this essay, The Return to Philology, where he talks about what a true philology is. And for Said, a true philology is active. It involves, quote, it involves getting inside the process of language already going on in words and making it disclose what may be hidden or incomplete or masked or distorted in any text we may have before us, unquote. And I think a critical philology is something which serves us, as I mentioned, as a kind of corrective that would be generative and perhaps even redemptive in the widest sense of that word. So I'll just leave it there as kind of what the task of a kind of criticism would be in this subfield of kind of Sikh philology. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sahota. Thank you very much. Next up, presenting is Puninder Singh, who is a doctoral candidate at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. You're a doctoral candidate in anthropology, and your doctoral work focused on the concepts of Shabad and Nam in theory and practice in Sikh tradition, if I've got that right. Thank you so much, and the virtual podium is yours.
Can I share my screen?
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. Can you all hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Okay, great. First, I want to just acknowledge the efforts of Dr. Pashara Singh and his team. Usually this is my biannual trip to California that I always look forward to, but given the difficult situation we're all in, I'm very happy that he's pressed forward with this sharing of knowledge yet again, even through this difficult time. And happy to be here. And I want to also thank Arvind for bringing us together on this panel. So this is a roundtable format. So again, it won't be a formal paper so much, but these are highlights from what hopefully will be a lengthier paper at some point. So I'm just going to provide a few highlights that hopefully will provide a platform for us to think about some issues in assessing the role of critical thought in Sikh studies. I will begin by acknowledging that there has been a lot of questioning of the place of critical thought within Sikh studies in recent years, and it's been ongoing for several decades. And this is really a part of a much larger debate that has taken place for nigh upon several centuries, actually. And it's really part of a debate that has taken place in what's now called area studies, what used to be called Orientalism, and so on and so forth. So this debate we're seeing within Sikh studies is in many ways a microcosm of that larger debate. I will also say at the outset that I consider myself a critic of critical thought, but I'm at the same time a strong advocate for engagement with critical studies. And I'll explain what I mean by that as we go along. So I have a few major highlights I'll just go through. The first of these is the role of critical thought in understanding the frameworks that we're already engaged with. The first most important framework that we engage with whenever we engage with the academy in any way are the structures of the knowledge systems that we enter into whenever we enter into any kind of formal academy. And this is, of course, true not only of the Western Academy, but of any Eastern Academy, Southern Academy, Northern Academy, and so on and so forth. Any type of knowledge system is already predates us with structures of knowledge that we enter into. Related to this, specifically in the field of Sikh studies, which always takes place in university forums these days, whether here in the West or in Punjab as well. What are the structures of the university itself? What is the purpose of knowledge? What kinds of knowledge can be produced? What kinds of knowledge are canonized and what kinds of knowledge are left out of the canon? Are we producing knowledge for the sake of knowledge, or does it serve some other instrumental purposes? So these are all questions that engaging with critical thought help us to answer. So critical thought here is a form of discernment. It's a form of not accepting the ready-made structures as a given. As I mentioned, whenever we enter into an encounter with academics or knowledge systems, we're inheriting a voluminous body of knowledge. And within that body of knowledge, there are already various sets of value judgments that are laminated throughout. So there's many different presuppositions about value that are imbricated in these value judgments, imbricated within the structures of university before we ever encounter it. We may end up contributing something to those structures of knowledge throughout our academic careers. But in order to do that, I would suggest here that we need to understand something about what these structures are. And then we can assess in what ways we're able to contribute to them. So this is, engagement with critical studies is not necessarily a rejection of structures that came before, but it's an assessment of what we're actually dealing with. So some of the major sort of ideational structures that we find that we're engaging with, particularly over the last century or so, and some of these a little longer than that, are the liberal formation, and now post-liberalism, neoliberalism, the secular, and also the post-secular, and Orientalism, as I mentioned before. And now we have post-Orientalism. And one might argue that we even have reached the stage of post-post in some of these cases, post-liberalism, post-Orientalism. As Bali just mentioned in relation to Orientalism, Edward Said's work was foundational, his 1978 book entitled Orientalism. It's been subject to voluminous critiques over the last 4 decades. One of those, the most trenchant critiques, is that Said critiqued the phenomenon of Orientalism, but in that critique, he allowed the overall framework of liberalism and secular humanism that he was working under to pass by unscathed or without critique. We've seen, as I said, various generations of critique, just to use Orientalism as an example, take place over the last 4 decades. And one thing we notice within critical thought, within the formations of critique, is there's really no end to critique. We see that in the very monikers of post, right? So we see post-liberalism, post-Orientalism, post-secular, and so on and so forth. The very prefix post suggests that they are dependent on previous forms of thought. In other words, in one way or another, they're always reacting to forms of thought that came before them. I would argue here that I would suggest that this falls under a certain genre of scientism. In our current scientific paradigm, we do have sort of scientific truths that look to us to be very solid, but in reality, science structurally, it's constantly dependent on theories and disproving old theories and proving new theories based on accumulation of additional data. So there's really no end to the scientific project. And I would argue that's the same case in the case of critical thought. But that does not mean that critical thought is not useful in the meantime. To bring Sikhi into the equation a little bit, I would argue that Sikhi is not necessarily reactionary in the same way that critical thought is. So to take the examples of, say, liberalism, secularism, and Orientalism, of course, the Sikh knowledge formation predates that by quite a bit. So it's not, we can take part in the discussions of the post-secular, the post-liberal, and so on and so forth. But Sikhi also, in some way, because it's a thought formation that predates liberalism and secularism, it's in some ways can also be used as a resource to go beyond those dialectical debates. it does have resources within it that can be used as a pushback against certain modern formations like capitalism, but Sikhi is also part of a much larger tradition, like the model of a darya, a vast river of which resources which can be used to critique capitalism, for instance, or just but one tributary within a much larger tradition. Not understanding these frameworks in which we're engaged simply means that we are subject to these frameworks without being able to answer back to them effectively. So I'll just provide one concrete example from recent, we've seen related to recent things that have been in the news over the last several months that we're all aware of, from the farmers' protest to the recent shooting in Indianapolis and the role of Sikhs and Sikh Gurdwaras in New Delhi in providing aid. For instance, we've seen yet another wave of the presence of Sikhs in various mainstream media sources. And unfortunately, we only seem to see Sikhs when in reaction to some kind of crisis or another. It's not always in a negative light, but it's always in reaction to crisis. And the way that Sikhi has to be framed in her modern media formations, in the formation of a very brief soundbite, perhaps by necessity or perhaps not, it tends to be this very formulaic kind of structure. For instance, this quotation comes from a op-ed that was published in the Washington Post just after the Indianapolis shooting a few weeks ago. It's a very familiar formula that you've all heard before. So it says, Sikhism is a monotheistic religion that emerged more than 500 years ago in the Punjab region of India. The founder of Sikhism, Guru Nanak, was born in 1469. Sikhs are distinguishable by their long beards and turbans. Of course, if you have had any engagement with Sikh tradition, in any way you've heard this formula rehearsed endless times in various different places. Why are this particular historiographical framing definitive of the Sikh tradition? This is something we can use critical thought to ask about, right? So it seems like a very innocuous thing. It's not factually incorrect in any way. But for instance, in these formulations, we don't have any mention of Turki Bani, Shabad Guru, and so on and so forth, which for a Sikh practitioner, those might be more definitive of the Sikh tradition. So we might ask through the lens of critical thought, who is the invisible questioner when we have to produce these formulations for various media sources and so on and so forth? Who is setting up the framework within which Sikhi can be defined for the public eye, for instance? So this is one way in which critical thought can be used to effectively assess what are the underlying structures that are allowing certain knowledges to emerge and preventing others. All right, to the next part. So engagement and dialogue. So as I mentioned before, these formations of liberalism, secularism, and so on, and their post versions, they are the current dominant paradigms within the academic context, whether we agree with them or not. We are talking about here today assessing the role of critical thought within Sikh studies, and that means we're assessing the role of critical thought within Sikh studies that takes place in the academy. So we're not necessarily talking about Sikhi that takes place in our households or in our Gurdwara, although those are also obviously equally important spaces. So if we are to take place in the academy, it behooves us to engage with these larger dominant paradigms. We have to, in a sense, engage with these. And it doesn't mean that we only have to engage with them on their terms, but we also have some agency in this engagement, I would argue. So, in terms of engagement, looking historically, I would argue, again, this is moving towards my last point, which is towards a Sikh form of thought. I would argue that Sikhi has always been a tradition of robust engagement and dialogue. So we have many countless examples of this from Guru Nanak's Udasis, in which Guru Nanak traveled on foot with his companion Mardana, to the north, south, east, and west, all known lands at that time, and engaged in dialogue with various different practitioners of various different types of traditions, which are many of them enshrined in the Janamsakhi tradition, of course. Within Guru Granth Sahib, we have his famous dialogue with the Nath yogis, Siddh Gosht, which literally takes the form of a very robust dialogue with neighboring tradition. We have the example of Bhai Nand Lal, whose works are unfortunately not very well known these days. Bhai Nand Lal is the only figure within Sikhi who's, besides Bhai Gurdas, whose works do not appear in Guru Granth Sahib, but whose works can be sung as Bani within the Gurdwara. And I find very few young Sikhs even are aware of that fact for various historical reasons. But Bhai Nand Lal, one of the main reasons is Bhai Nand Lal's works were written largely in Persian, which has become not quite lost to us, but it's become a very rare occurrence when someone has had the opportunity to learn Persian to the level where they can understand Bhai Nand Lal. And if you read Bhai Nand Lal's works, it's very much in a very robust dialogue with the neighboring traditions, especially the Persian and Sufi traditions, very closely related to the works of Hafiz, for instance, aesthetically. And of course, we have Guru Gobind Singh's Zafarnama as another example of a very robust linguistic engagement. So I would argue that, following the story of Baisakhi and Guru Gobind Singh's asking for one more person to sacrifice their head, comfort is not really a part of the Sikh ethos, but sitting with discomfort, grappling with the mind and the ego are really where the Sikh ethos reside. And I would argue that engagement with those knowledge formations, even those that we don't necessarily agree with, is really an essential part of the Sikh tradition. To the next part, critiquing critical thought. So as I said, engaging with critical thought doesn't necessarily mean that we have to accept it wholesale without talking back to it. I would argue critical thought should not be itself immune to critique. And I think most critical theorists would also agree with this. We do see examples where there can be uncritical engagement with critical theory or the uncritical deployment of critical theory. So people might, for instance, deploy a Foucauldian framework to analyze something within the Sikh tradition or any other tradition, which doesn't necessarily vibe well with that tradition itself. Although sometimes those can be productive, but sometimes they're really in the service of advancing critical thought and not the subject matter of the analysis itself. So that's something we have to be careful about. Are we obscuring the subject matter with theory? And this has been a critique of critical theory for sure, and I think a valid one. Is theory being used in the service of work, or is work being used in the service of theory? I would argue that we are implored not only to apply theory, but to engage with it, modify it, push back against it, and even to dismiss it in some cases. I would invoke Marx's famous pronouncements, whether he really said this or not is not clear, but he may have said it. He's supposed to have said, "I am not a Marxist," Karl Marx said. So the spirit of it is that if his own theory and structure of knowledge becomes dogmatic, then he doesn't want to be a part of it. He's a part of Marxism, the system that bears his own name, insofar as it can be deployed as a processual way of analysis. But when it becomes dogmatic, then he's no longer considers himself part of that. And I think this spirit, Karl Marx being one of the progenitors of the modern critical thought sphere, I think this spirit, although it's not always used in this way, I think we can engage with that. Through the examples I gave before of engagement and dialogue, I would push back against the idea that engagement with neighboring traditions is somehow alien to the Sikh tradition. I think that's an important point. It doesn't mean, using critical studies doesn't mean necessarily that critical studies itself is the maximal framework. Right? It's just a tool in a toolbox, and we can use it at our will, but you have to understand critical studies in order to be able to do that and engage with the rest of the academy. All right, finally, just a few points that hopefully we can engage with in the open discussion. So towards Sikh thought or Sikh Chintan, to reemphasize the end of engagement with critical thought doesn't have to be solely the advancement of critical thought or critical theory itself. We can use that for our own purposes as well. You know, for some people, that may be the goal, and that's fine. You know, not everyone is engaged in the project of developing Sikh thought. And there are certainly people who are, and I think we should invite that actually. But for those people, for those persons who are interested in the engagement of advancement and development of a Sikh form of thought, we have to remember that this is a byway, this is a way station along the way. There are several ways in which a Sikh methodology can push back against critical studies methodology. For instance, in an analysis of the current events from a Sikh perspective. So Arvind mentioned earlier the farmers' protests, which I hope we can delve into in more detail in our discussion. This has been analyzed from various different perspectives, from a Marxist perspective, from a critique of capitalism, and so on and so forth. But there is also a Sikh perspective to it. And I think that is one of the reasons why the protest has expanded beyond just protests against very specific agricultural policies into a more general protest against certain right-wing and fascist tendencies more generally. So it's become something much broader than simply an agricultural protest. And I think I would argue that that's at least in part based because it's taking inspiration from various Sikh principles. Lastly, I'll just say that Sikhi is itself a methodology. It's a way of seeing, a way of analyzing, and a way of experiencing and making sense of sensory data. And we should engage with all of the forms of thought in a very robust way and at any opportunity. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Puninder Singh. Really appreciate it. I will introduce the last speaker, and then we will open up for a panel discussion. Dr. Harjeet Grewal he teaches Sikhism and religious philosophy courses in the Department of Classics and Religion at the University of Calgary. He completed his dissertation titled Janam Sakhi, Retracing Networks of Inspiration at the University of Michigan in 2017. His research interests include Sikh philosophy, diaspora, and literature. Thank you so much for joining us. You have the virtual podium.
Hi, Adam, can you just confirm that everyone can hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again to Peshora and the organizers of the conference. Thanks to all my panelists, co-panelists, and for everyone who's still with us at this time. Thank you for sticking it through. So I have the pleasure of being the last speaker today, and I'm going to focus in on some of how these issues pertain, the issue of critical thinking and the difficulties of using this in the Sikh Studies field within the field itself, questions that have risen from within Sikh Studies regarding this a little bit. So that'll be the focus of my paper, and then I'm going to talk actually a little bit about, use one example of how Punu mentioned as well, but the Janam Sakhis can be used potentially to engage in forms of critical thinking, and that those types of ways of applying these texts are available to us. So in discussing the role and function of critique and critical thinking in Sikh Studies, I will consider how such terms have previously been used in the field. For those of us, myself included, who seek to uncover space for thinking about and debating pressing problems facing humanity, and therefore Sikhs everywhere, While using Sikh intellectual resources and perspectives, it still seems that the spirit of academic freedom and exchange cuts mainly one way within Sikh studies. And Sikh studies being something that's occurring within academia by and large, what the earlier speakers have discussed, I'll just take for granted as a larger problem with the institutionalization of the university and the frameworks and epistemologies that exist there. So, however, it is increasingly vital to engage in critical thinking using Sikh sources, including canonical, early, and contemporary sources. Not only for overcoming operations of intellectual and governmental policing that continue to hamper our field, but also to engage in meaningful conversations about diversity, justice, and equity. Today, I will briefly discuss the implications of the interpretation of the term skeptical or critical historian and traditional historian by W.H. MacLeod in an essay which Arvind mentioned earlier, Cries of Outrage, published in 1994 and subsequently published again in 2000 in a book of essays by MacLeod. Secondly, I will consider how we might extrapolate a question about justice from the Sajjan Tag Saki to reconsider how Sikh sources enable critical thinking through the very kind of textual matter that we have before us and the patterns and frameworks and epistemologies that exist therein. Critical thinking is central to the Western intellectual tradition as it defines itself to be. It has to do with the use of different faculties of mind, such as rationality or emotivity. It is vital to European self-understanding from the Enlightenment onward. It's equally important in the civilizational mission in colonies across the world as a tool to Westernize, and in doing so, continue to dominate so-called non-Western civilizations. Whether you want to use the terms global North and global South, that type of domination is still occurring today. Critical thinking is central to education as well as key problematics in academics. It is thought to be important for advancing society through engaging the public sphere. Not only does it remain the essential binary operation for differentiating between ruler and ruled, intellect and informant, in the early decades of the century, it has realigned and regained vitality as an exclusionary term to integrate, subjugate, and dominate cultures that actively oppose Western intellectual and governmental forms. By and large, this is happening through the conversation around secularism and integrating minorities who appear threatening to the state within the confines of secularism, whether it be through legal or cultural forms of pressure. Despite the critiques of Orientalism, the attempts at looking at subaltern histories and post-colonial scholarship, it is curious to note that discussions about the validity of critique and critical thinking in Sikh studies remained relatively muted. This is all the more disconcerting considering the extent of violence and oppression that Sikhs have faced in their post-colonial lives globally. Despite rises in hate crimes and anti-Sikh violence since the mid-1980s in South Asia and North America following 9/11, and Pundu again mentioned the recent attacks, there is still no sustained conversation by intellectuals in Sikh studies about how such events relate to more significant global questions about equity, justice, and anti-oppression discourse. Most of these questions are embraced and researched by a generation of Sikh activists globally, which often work outside of or in tangent to university knowledge institutions. And often they're antagonistic to those institutions, as we've heard in previous panels today. Within academia, it remains the case that the Sikh community is by and large discussed historically, using inferences to read the gaps, quote unquote, or silences in the archive. Even when disciplines like anthropology, literature, or political science are driving the research, the focus is often descriptive or historicist. Studies often use security state epistemes to configure segments of the Sikh community as violent fundamentalists who threaten civilization, as victims of random chaotic violence needing protection, or as paragons of democratic multicultural ideals. The work of Brian Keith Axel has shown this is the promise and the threat that is contained in Sikh embodiment. While Sikh intellectuals have engaged in modern problematics, I'm concerned that these engagements are monotheolingual and circulate in expensive Western academic presses. They are often aloof to the research of Sikh Punjabi scholars whose work circulates in a much smaller sphere. Together, these omissions cause a type of erasure. They further colonial paradigms and foment the so-called anti-intellectualism that many in Sikh studies vehemently decry. These omissions, I suggest, are also partly producing the lacuna around critical Sikh thought. To understand how this erasure impacts critical Sikh thought, it is helpful to look at the essay Cries of Outrage by W.H. MacLeod. MacLeod is responding, as we've heard already, to some of the boisterous critics who were engaging his scholarship. But he's also disciplining the very form of criticism and how criticism can occur. He states, I quote, "Skeptical historians, after all, are not in the business of burning and pillaging. They are not trying to suppress inconvenient evidence. They do not engage in fallacious reasoning." There's a parenthesis here, at least not consciously or deliberately, end parentheses. And they certainly do not foster misinformation campaigns. Traditional historians need to recognize this and to address the skeptical historian in terms which recognize the latter's honesty. MacLeod goes on to state that the truth, quote, and understanding should be objectives of the skeptical historian, and that he wants the competition to, quote, observe the rules of decency and fair play. Although worthy of comment, it is not the gaslighting or social trauma triggering that is going on in MacLeod's choice of diction, nor his contradictory requests for charity and forbearance, while cordoning off honesty, truth, and understanding within the courtyard of his self-referential use of the term skeptical historian that I would like to address in my talk today. Instead, I will comment on the creation of the historiographic paradigm he's outlining here, being two opposed terms, a traditional historian and skeptical historian, which enacts a horizon of limitation, straining the emergence of critical Sikh thought. This epistemology confines research on the Sikh tradition within the bounds of historical discourse. Any impact or relevance of contemporaneity for Sikhs is occluded. It also renders mere doubt and criticism synonymous, effectively impeding the validity and impact of critical thought. The binary opposition created affects a denial of coevalness and should be reconsidered. Many scholars of the Sikh tradition in Punjab were critical of MacLeod's work from the beginning of his career. The criticism only increased and bordered on open hostility as time went on. So by the 90s, when he's writing this, things were a little bit hostile. However, there was no systematic terminology to describe this criticism historiographically until MacLeod invents these terms, traditional historian and skeptical critical historian. Although recognizing some variance in perspectives, MacLeod states that these terms refer to two kinds of historians, quote, ranged against each other in this battle for understanding the true nature of the Sikh Panth. Traditional historians, as he describes, are rooted in pious belief in their religion, defend the traditions of the Panth, and have a, quote, well-integrated version of the Panth's history before them, and therefore trust the sources. Skeptical historians, on the other hand, doubt and rigorously scrutinize the sources to ensure that every fact is backed by believable evidence. This is what he's claiming anyways. While traditional historians prefer belief, the skeptical historian prefers reason and the quote unquote insecurity of doubt. Rigorous scrutiny is a necessity for the skeptic, but not for the traditionalist. The traditionalist is dogmatic in approach to text and aggressive in their critique, whereas the skeptic is on a quest for truth through rigorous critical examination of sources and embraces discussion over argumentation. Rather than address the questions that continue to be raised regarding gaps and omissions in MacLeod's own scholarship, an ideological divide is systematized here in this essay into the very framework of Sikh studies, to shut out critical scrutinization of scholars from Punjab, who by and large shared in MacLeod's skeptical method, but differed in their analysis, reach, and conclusions. And I think this is one of the reasons why largely scholars from Punjab have a struggle in terms of reaching the same audiences that scholars who are privileged, such as ourselves out here, can reach. MacLeod exudes privilege and stature over his peers by having access to the best presses and access to resources, wealth of the Western universities. And whiteness gives him mobility unmatched by those he diminutively refers to as traditional historians. While downgrading so-called traditional historians' belief in the Sikh tradition, MacLeod is aloof to his own belief in the supremacy of rationality and the peculiar quest for authentic origins. The systematization of these terms effectively shut down debate without being exacted to the governmental drive to power that first requires that Sikh scholars enter the skeptical fold in order to be critical. Critical scholarship is used here as a synonym for skepticism or doubt. Quote, a sound critical historian is above all else a skeptical historian, end quote. Moreover, the historical approach is totalizing in this essay, and this totalization discourages critical engagement beyond its horizons even today. MacLeod states, quote, most insistently, I would maintain that Sikhism must be studied from a historical point of view, end quote. The terms traditional and skeptical historian have been used to speak to late 20th century historiography of the Sikh tradition beyond MacLeod's own scholarship. This is seen used in various essays and in various monographs by scholars in the field. The implications of these terms in the nascent field of Sikh studies are significant as they seek to legitimize historical scholars alone. Skeptical historians become the priests of Sikh studies, are beyond reproach and must be defended by the powers of Western colonist universities and within settler colonial public spheres. While rhetorically, the essay seems to encourage discussion and exchange, I suggest that it does the opposite by denying coevalness to those who criticize the skeptic. Such criticism is seen as unfounded, invalid, and merely ideological because when it takes tradition and tradition seriously, it can be cast aside. These categories carry implications of racist nativism. Traditional historians can only refer to scholars who identify as Sikh, maybe even exclusively Sikh, but also because trespass can only occur from traditional to skeptical through objective, disinterested suspension of belief. So if you want to be a Sikh scholar and you want to be a skeptical Sikh scholar, you'll embrace this suspension of belief and rational way of thinking objectively about history and the Sikh tradition. These issues together impact critical thinking and critical discourse to occur through the application of Sikh sources to contemporary issues in academia broadly. So this is one of the things that prevent engagement with critical thought, critical problems using Sikh sources. I want to suggest that Sikh sources are governed and policed by skeptics and traditionalists together, as per the twin categories defined by MacLeod himself. Through an insistence upon a resolution to impossible questions of authenticity and origin before applying the sources to critical thinking, the totalization of the sources through exclusively historical approaches is a bridge point to allow but delimit their applicability to contemporary issues. And it's a way to let them into the Western university, but also kind of delimit the space that they occupy. Meaning and interpretation occur in a plane of time that has been eclipsed or exists only in the past. The splitting of narrative time in this way between a contemporary discussion about historical authenticity, memory, and community developed versus the earlier nativist time of Sikh textual meaning, making it possible to police and govern critical thinking by invalidating such exercises and making publishing of these exercises a challenge. Despite these challenges, the Sikh sources provide a wealth of resources to engage in critical thinking exercises. What is needed for critical engagement through Sikh sources is a pivot outside this historiographical paradigm, coupled with a rejection of the traditional skeptic binary, a rejection which is factual, as the Sikh tradition is not only subjectively diverse, but has produced strong skeptical thinkers and critics for centuries. And Punu mentioned a few in his talk just recently. The Sajjan Tug Sakhi provides an example of how Janam Sakhis were written to provoke critical thought and discussion. Therefore, they may be apt for critical applications. I will be discussing this Sakhi, the Sajjan Tug Sakhi, using the B6 Janam Sakhi manuscript version, which is found on folios 37 recto to 39 verso. The Sajjan Tug Sakhi recounts the gratuitous theft and murder of unsuspected travelers by Sajjan Tug, an educated resident of Makhdumpur or Tulamba, which is in modern-day Pakistan. Nanak and his companion Mardana chance upon Sajjan's domicile on their way to from Sultanpur to Delhi, Like other travelers, they think the hospice of an educated sheikh is a safe place to stay. They proceed to enter Sajjan Tug's residence with the intent to spend the night there. Nanak has a dialogue with Sajjan Tug, which prompts him to beg forgiveness for his past deeds. Nanak instructs him that forgiveness is possible only by forsaking his lifestyle and giving away his ill-gotten wealth. Nanak spends a few months with Sajjan Tug, teaching him. Upon departing the area, he tells Sajjan Tug to create a dharamshala so people could gather and learn from the Sheikh. The space wherein weary travelers who are stripped of their belongings and lives is transformed by this encounter with Nanak into a reinvigorated space for learning. I suggest that this Sakhi speaks to questions of justice in creating decolonized and deracialized spaces for engagement. The question of justice embeds itself in the Sakhi and can be read as critical of punitive forms of justice as well, when we move beyond the dominance of history alone. Sajjan Tug is a heinous-faced character who runs a hospice wherein he identifies people based on their identity or subjectivity and treats them with generosity and hospitality. He then proceeds to murder them. He is able to locate Guru Nanak. He's unable to locate Guru Nanak and Bhai Mardana. Therefore, he does not know how to treat them and proceeds to rush them to bed so that he may murder and rob them. Nanak insists on reciting a Shabad on the bonds of the self formed. It says, Shabad Khudai ki bandgi ka. Hearing the Shabad, Sajjan Tug is transformed and rather than being punished. Sajjan Tug gains knowledge of his misdeeds and desires bakshish or Nanak's intercession on his behalf to remove any account of his negative actions, guna or pap. Begging for Nanak's benevolent intercession for salvation, he says, Ji mere guna fadl karo, ji bahut pap kite hain. Nanak defers any intercession on behalf of Sajjan by stating, in the court of Khuda, full account is taken. Khudai ki dargah due gali guna hunde hain. Sajjan requests that Nanak tell him some way to have recourse. So Nanak then instructs him to do three things. He says to speak the truth, give away what he has stolen as alms, and recite Guru Guru. Nanak's advice suggests that Sajjan balance his accounts by engaging in the recitation of Naam, teaching and practicing of charity. Sajjan is told to open a center of learning or dharamshala, and we are told he becomes a Naam Tariqat Sikh. Has Sajjan been redeemed? If so, what type of justice is this? Guru Nanak's encounter here with a civilized individual, in contemporary terms, we might think of as a serial murderer, someone who indiscriminately is killing in order to enrich himself. Let's think about the Sakhi in these terms. Someone who invites them into his abode and makes them comfortable only to rob them of their lives and their material possessions should hardly be given charge of a central Sikh institution responsible for teaching people Guru Nanak's message. And yet here we have that. We know from John Malcolm's sketch of the Sikhs that a Sikh Gyani who had early contact with the British was critical of British ideas of punitive justice, which he saw as barbaric. Without the ability to critically engage Sikh texts and living intellectual traditions, as we're discussing here, it is unlikely that critical questions can be answered. Given that questions about justice are at the forefront of academic and activist concerns, it may be that the Sikh tradition has something to contribute to these conversations. I want to close by thinking about how, in a different way, this critical conversation is prevented. Something which I recently learned about is other humanizing tendencies in Western intellectual discourse that prevent and police critical engagement from minoritized or oppressed groups. At the least, they continue to exert a civilizing requirement that absolves privileged groups, whether they are caste, race, or intellectual privileges, from responsibility or acquiesces to their fragility in order to discuss issues that are concerning everybody. In a recent AAR webinar on anti-racism teaching, Stephen G. Ray Jr., the president of Chicago Theological Seminary, referred to this as the other humanizing effects of scholarship and pedagogy within today's university. Other humanization is an ideational framework that refuses to generalize colonial and racialized lived experience and the knowledges that are contained within these experiences It insists that these experiences and problematics connected to them are self-referential only. So these are general problems, are the problems that privileged people have, minoritized, racialized communities have their own subjective problems, and when they speak through their own sources, they're speaking self-referentially only to those problems. We cannot generalize these problems. So rehumanizing, he suggests, is a critical endeavor, and voices can do this by insisting that the unique sources of the other humanized also exist within and can contribute to general problematics. We need to validate the expressions of these other humans and how they think and how thinking is available to them, and brings us into a broader, more equitable conversation about these issues. Attempts to engage Sikh sources and Sikh intellectual concerns as speaking to the general problematics can be facilitated partially by imagining a future of Sikh studies that embraces critical thought within its discursive folds. Thanks, everyone. That's what I have to say.
Excellent. And now feel free. I will be a clock on the wall, and I'll be listening intently and enjoying your conversation. Maybe if we can just be mindful that at 4:20, we'll have a break. So let's leave however much time you feel for Q&A, general Q&A, perhaps around 4:10, whatever you want.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Adam. I was intrigued by a comment that Shinder made earlier on this morning. Used the phrase the classical Sikh studies, and we need more of that. And I just wonder if you could just throw this out. And I know that Harjeet and Punu and to some extent Bali also, you've kind of answered this as well, but is there an opposition between critical thought and your ideas of critique and classical Sikh studies? If I can just begin an answer to that, my own sort of work is kind of reformulated in understanding critique precisely by the nature of the texts that we study, and also the lived experience of Sikhs as well. And it's the multiplicitous nature of these texts, the fact that they don't fit into models of critique, that forces you to actually take on those models of critique in the first place. If the text didn't do that, and if lived experience wasn't multiplicitous in that way, I think I would be far less motivated to even touch something like critical theory. So there is a reason why I'm doing it, but I'm just throwing it out. If people want to just take this up a little further.
Yeah, I mean, I can just start the conversation. I really appreciated Bunu's comments about taking critique itself as an object of study and to be continually reflexive about what is the nature of critique, what are the methodologies of critique that we're using, how is critical theory being mobilized. And so likewise, I would say, I think moving forward in Sikh studies, I approach any categorizations or typologies that we might make about different varieties of Sikh studies scholarship through a kind of critical lens. And I want to sort of historicize them and understand where it is that they're coming from, where it is that they're emerging from. And so a question for me that would emerge immediately is, how do we construct and define what we mean by classical Sikh studies? And how is that being defined at any point in time, place, context, etc.? And what is it being demarcated, or what is it being sort of walled off from, in opposition to or in relation to? And I think similarly, there was in an earlier, in one of the earlier presentations, there was a discussion about concerns around reorientalization or a reorientalizing project that might be emerging in new directions in Sikh studies. And I think, yes, the project of self-orientalism is an ongoing concern, but again, something that I pick up as an object of study, and I want to understand it in context as as claims are being made, right, around whether it's politics or religion, culture, whatever category that we're using at any given time. So for me, oftentimes, I'm aware of self-orientalizing projects, but I locate them less in the kind of critical turn that we are talking about, but as these ongoing colonial formations that keep emerging within our field that we seem to have a constant problem and issue with. And so, so self-orientalizing, I think, also is emerging out of the nature of Sikh studies in the US Academy, right? It's emerging because of the fact that that Sikh studies is primarily community donor-led. So it's not only the university structure that wants us to self-orientalize ourselves as Sikhs who represent Sikh studies. Oftentimes, community leaders might be invested in those projects as well. And so as intellectuals, I call it this process of constantly sort of playing along, but resisting as well, that you're simultaneously doing, and you're doing it with multiple actors, all while trying to move a critical project along, or to just be able to move the field along. And that's how I would define this kind of intellectual and academic practice. But I'd love to hear what other folks think about this.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in here too. I think, you know, for me, I think there's two key issues, and that kind of each part of my paper kind of touches on those. I think first of all, there's been kind of a stagnancy in, or kind of a tippy-toeing around critiquing work amongst colleagues in the field itself. Which I think is what I was trying to suggest in the essay was an outcome of some of those early kind of clashes, I guess you can call them, in the field. And we saw some pictures of some of those conferences, and those of us who are either there or have heard the stories know that there was quite kind of loud debate in those some of those conferences. So I think first and foremost, a critical project tries to reinstate dialogue and exchange between Sikh studies scholars and the various perspectives and the disciplines within which we offer. I think, and that's really one of the things that's really exciting about Sikh studies is its multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary approach. So it offers a really good place to have these conversations. So I think part of the critical project is re-engaging in being able to critique one another and recognizing that these critiques aren't ad hominem attacks, and we don't need to kind of, you know, create these, you know, diametrically opposed kind of factions in order to proceed and just have camps which are talking to one another but aren't talking to the rest of the colleagues that are doing other work, which is equally interesting, and we can all kind of be sustained by the different work we do in a truly multidisciplinary way. The second thing I think is, you know, what Arvind was talking about, you know, while we're talking about, you know, objective approaches or you know, different epistemological frameworks within which, all of which can be used for study of the Sikh tradition. One of the things that is often totally not addressed is the question of, you know, reclaiming or having a sovereign approach through Sikh epistemology itself, and re-engaging that, I think, is also central to re-engaging Punjab scholars who are, you know, I think that there's been in the last 20, 30 years kind of a bifurcation in the conversations. Punnu, you can probably speak about this too, the conversations going on in Punjab, and I saw this when I was researching, I'm sure Punnu, you know very well as well. The conversations in Punjab are very different than what are going on here, and they're very different or what are going on in other parts of India as well about Sikhs, and so to kind of re-engage and kind of find a more equitable way to treat each other on those sides by recognizing that, you know, Sikh epistemology and someone's connection to that doesn't make them any less skeptical or unable to do skeptical work. So, you know, MacLeod doesn't recognize this in his essay, but you know, he doesn't name anybody, but a lot of the people who he is responding to, like Harbans Singh, other scholars who were, you know, Pyar Singh, Guriqbal Singh, on and on, who were skeptical of his work and criticizing his work for certain occlusions, certain omissions, they aren't mentioned at all. So there is that denial of coevalness, putting them simply as people who are following this pious belief in the Sikh tradition, when they were actually engaged in rigorous, secular, doubtful engagement with the Janam Sakhi text and other texts, just as he himself was. They just came to different conclusions. And so rather than address those conclusions, this bifurcation is created. And I think that's kind of stayed. So overcoming those things is connected to, I think, reintegrating with some of the conversations that are going on in Punjab. And there's been a big movement in Punjab, especially following you know, the genocide, the massacres of Sikhs, and all the oppression that continues in anti-Sikh, you know, realities on the ground in Punjab. There's a lot of movement and traction in terms of intellectualism and conversations that are actively using Sikh epistemology. We just don't know that, and no one in the Sikh studies field outside of Punjab has done the work where they recognize these people and bring them in, whether it's through translation, whether it's through good philological exercises, or whether it's just through dialogue and exchange, but actually recognizes their name, their work, and is talking to them. So I think, maybe you can talk about that a little bit as well.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, this is you know, all things I've been thinking about myself, and I just wanted to mention quickly. I want to make sure we have some great questions. One very deeply layered question by Connor. So I want to make sure we get. I had to reread it several times. It's a great question. Well, I want to make sure we get that. I think that will open up some other points we want to make. Yeah, I think this is a phrase I got from Bali, so I want to give academic credit where it's due. In a discussion we had some time back, I think he used the phrase reclaiming philology. I think that's something that's essential. This is, again, ties back to what I was saying earlier in my brief presentation about understanding the structures that we've already inherited that frame what we're able to study and how before we even get to it. And this has been a debate, literally more than 200-year-old debate, 250-year-old debate within what's broadly called Orientalism, which is the importance of, let's say, text versus lived experience and practice. Right? This has been all the way back to the very beginnings of the colonial enterprise, which highly privileged text. Right? We know that, you know, the Manusmriti and, you know, certain traditional forms of Islamic law, and so those were privileged over living forms that were right in front of the administrators and so on and so forth. I don't think there's no reason why that particular form of Orientalism owns texts or the ability to understand texts. You know, I think that's part of that long line of an intellectual tradition, but I think we need to reclaim that. And when I say we, I mean those people whose sole interest is not in just simply privileging the text. So the Sikh tradition is a great example of that. So our text, you know, so to speak, is a guru, right? It's a living being, it's a living presence, right? So it's not just a text, but it's also something that we engage with, right? It's not just privileging of text. It's something that informs our actual lived experiences. That's but one example, right? So I think we need to wrestle philology away from this knowledge formation that sort of traps it within this very narrow kind of sphere. And that's one thing I think we need to do. And, you know, the analysis of text, again, to go back to, you know, since we're talking within the frame of Sikh studies here, that's been part of Sikh studies, that's been a part of the Sikh tradition from day one, right? From Bhai Gurdas, the very first exegete of Guru Granth Sahib, right? That those go back to the very earliest days of our tradition. So it's not, why should that be the exclusive provenance of, you know, philologists and linguists? And this is not to, you know, go overboard and say the philology and the linguistics is, we should throw it all out either, right? There is some valuable work there. But this exclusive, you know, limiting on to what text can be and how we can read it, I think that's something we need to seriously question. I think that's again why this engagement with critical thought is so important. So we're not just accepting, these are structures, again, that go back centuries, right? It's, if you enter, there's still a thing called the American Orientalist Society, right? They just had their annual meeting recently, a few months ago. So it's still called the American Orientalist Society, right? They're not even at the stage of questioning whether that's really an appropriate way. There may be some individuals who question whether that's an appropriate way to approach it, but it's still the dominant form of thinking. That's what we inherit if we enter this field within the Western Academy, where this is the dominant paradigm. Not to say that there haven't been individuals that have pushed back against it, but so this is the kind of thing this is where critical studies, critical thought can be important to us. It's a tool in our toolbox, right? And it's, I would suggest we need to merge together our already traditional practices of Gurbani Vichar, for instance, right? I suppose that could be related to philology in some way, the study of meaning, right? The study of meaning. So it's not, again, not something alien to the Sikh tradition. So we need to look for these, it's not the same thing either, right? So we need to look for these parallels and engagements back and forth. So that's how I would suggest. And let's not forget Connor's questions.
Yeah, there's a few really good questions here.
Yeah, and Parvinder's too. I see Parvinder.
Yeah,
Hi.
Yeah, should we head over to the Q&A? Shall I read out Connor's first then? And then whoever would like to take it, feel free. Is that all right?
I think maybe Nihal's was a long time before Connor's. We could actually tie some of these together, I think.
Sure.
Maybe we could just answer that first, then go to Connor's and other questions as well.
Okay.
I can just read Nihal Singh's question to get us going. So the panelists appear to be in general agreement that the epistemic situation of Sikh studies in Western academia is uncongenial to the study of Gursikhi and or the sort of scholarship they would most like to contribute. This raises the question, were there independent funding and institutional support outside of the Western Academy for Gursikh scholarship? Would the problem be solved? If so, what sort of scholarship could we look forward to? And if not, why not? And then I think that ties also with some of Connor's questions about knowledge formations and interdisciplinarity in the university as well.
Yeah, I think it also ties to Parvinder's question as well. So I think there's a thread running through those questions. I'll take a quick stab at it. I won't go on for very long, but I think the question of working outside of the Western Academy is a non-starter. It's not the academy as such. It's not individuals in the academy as such that is the problem. It's structures of thought that are problematic, which don't allow for multiplicitous thinking, if you like. I'm searching for words to this. I don't think you can create a kind of a Sikh bubble outside of this. Everything is connected. When colonialism, imperialism happened, it basically created a hegemonic form of thought, which we're all part of, whether we like it or not. And just by being involved in education structures that are pretty much similar, whether they're in India or outside in the West, we can't get away from that. And frankly, I wouldn't want to. My way of answering that is that I think you can't change the system as such. I think you have to claim it. In the same way that I would want to claim citizenship, I would want to claim the epistemic structure of that system and my absolute sovereign right to be able to change it. And I think that's what, if you look at the core of what Jewish thought has done, that's what it's done. It has created, it has made inroads into Western thought in ways that I think Muslim scholars are beginning to do now. The process has only just begun, but you cannot do it outside of the academy. So short answer is, it's like claiming citizenship. Basically, you've got to claim it and you've got to work within it. And that comes partly from understanding the multiplicitous nature of ourselves. Even if we live in Punjab, I think there is a group of scholars there who argue exactly this, that everybody is in a state of diaspora, even if they're in Punjab. So we need to kind of understand this straight away.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on that, Arvind, in thinking about the case of anthropology departments, and Banu probably is also familiar with this. I talked about how anthropology departments are still a very fraught space because there are these very contesting visions about what the object of study is, right? And it's so up for grabs right now with all of these strains of critical thought and moves to decolonize, et cetera. But you know, to have a chair positioned in an anthropology department, I could very much just be this parochial, exotic thing studying, studying Sikh communities in California, and maybe some folks in the department would be totally fine with that, and things would proceed as they are, and the university would be totally fine with that because it's taking care of its mandate to support Californian communities, et cetera. But it fulfills its project of minoritization and domestication. What I'm trying to do is to say, yeah, Sikhi is a form of reason in itself, and maybe we need to shift anthropology to really being a site of thinking about these global forms of thought and lived experience and practice. And the way that I've been trying to do that is by involving faculty, colleagues, and students in all the Sikh studies programming and having them learn about Sikh concepts and ideas and thinking about them in relation to maybe liberal concepts, right? Or concepts coming from Black studies or Indigenous studies or what have you. And so we're starting to have an interesting, robust dialogue happening in the department. Like it's just starting. And I don't know how successful this is going to be and what it's going to look like, but I really do think the academy needs to move in that direction. And even when I was trying to think about how to frame the Intro to Sikh Studies class, I ended up coming up with, we are studying Sikh collectivities and communities who orient themselves around the Shabad Guru, right? And who we're studying Sikh life as it's unfolding. Not that we're just studying Sikh communities that exist out there in some kind of bubble that don't have anything to do with our real lives, but that we're all invested in these questions. And I have majority non-Sikh students in my classes, right? And so it's clicking with them, I think. I mean, it's an experiment in a way, but we're trying to figure out ways to make inroads in the existing structure of the university. Those are just some pedagogical examples. Yeah.
I mean, I think for me, like, first of all, Nihal, I appreciate the question. If you're still out there, but I would kind of say that and I agree with both Anneeth and Arvind in the sense that we can't evacuate the university as an intellectual space and a viable, vibrant one that offers a lot for Sikh studies, but also for the diversity of different Sikh subjectivities that exist. In a very productive way. But I also think that there's already on the one side a variety of institutions that do represent Sikh intellection in different ways. And there's a vibrant debate about the position of those institutions. One of the places where that's going on most vigorously is in Punjab, of course. But in the diaspora amongst activists, groups, and also other young, third, fourth generation Sikhs, there are active questions about building different types of independently funded institutions in North America as well as the UK. And I think those are great and very viable options in the sense that they enrich the types of stuff that potentially may not happen in a university space. They can make those maneuvers in those kinds of spaces. And that's kind of what's been happening in the kind of this conversation around activism or grassroots. Often people say, it's the grassroots that does this. So I think that impulse will grow eventually into different kind of institutional frameworks that are unique in the diaspora. And some of the challenges that are going on in Punjab in again, I think Guriqbal was saying this is that, creating two nations or several nations in South Asia didn't finish the job, it just kind of started it. And I think some of the conversations around, kind of intellectual institutions and just Sikh institutions in general are going on right now and are related to some of that latter work in the sense of decolonizing further South Asia and trying to find space where different types of Sikh subjectivities feel that they have open engagement in the ways that they want to see it. So I think there's room for a bunch of different options here. The university obviously is a great place, and I think the Sikh community will move very quickly to create other spaces in the diaspora, in the short term.
And a quick answer to Amit Orji's question. I think that this whole thing that if you critique Sikh studies, you're a right winger or whatever, I think it's a bit of a non-starter. I think that the real issue is that I think people who began critiquing Sikh studies did not properly understand how the system worked. And it's as simple as that. I don't think a lot of them were doctors, engineers, etc., and were not able to understand the minutiae of, the humanities system and the social sciences, etc. As they're becoming educated, I think those kind of critiques will either go away or just become far more nuanced, so that we have a really proper dialogue, etc. And it's unfortunate that the 90s saw a lot of this nastiness, and I think not just the 90s, but the last 15 years, to be honest. But it can go away, I think, and will go away. Anyway.
Might be a good idea to sort of delineate some of the questions that are salient at this point, so we're not just returning back to the same thing. But one thing that might be worth exploring is how the colonial machinery, say in the 19th century, with the sort of ethnological projects, especially with like photography, you see this most explicitly, just try to capture people and contain them and almost deprive them of a kind of life, and took all the things that they once worked with, whether artifacts, works of art, and put them in various sorts of museums or exhibits, deprived now of that kind of generativity. And this is something that Bernard Cohn, the anthropologist / historian, examines in some of his work, which really broke out of the framework of a kind of structural functionalist anthropology that worked with sort of units like the village, and put the focus back on something like the operations of the colonial institutions and the power that undergirded them. And I think these kinds of examples are very interesting to look at, because there's a sort of way in which I think the richness of the Sikh tradition, for lack of a better word, is impoverished by some of the kind of inheritance of this sort. And I think about a kind of philological project that would entertain a greater engagement with sort of contact zones that might sort of spill out in a really wide-ranging ways. For instance, it's interesting to think about the term nirguna and where it comes from. So the Shankara's Bhashya on the Brahma Sutra, I think maybe one of the initial points where the term nirguna is sort of articulated, and that'd be a very different kind of genealogy of the sort of of the kind of the longue durée, and that's just one example of a kind of project that philology could undertake, to sort of break out of some of the constraints that have been imposed and sort of return a kind of life and generativity and a kind of dynamic that some of the colonial frameworks seem to undo. almost sort of if that makes sense. So it's a kind of a critical approach would be one that is reflective of some of the kinds of inheritances. And it's interesting that people get caught up in this term critique, but it'd be interesting just to think about, questions of immanence alongside critique. This is something that seems to be lost within traditions of academic scholarship all around. And that's where, is the approach that's at hand equal to the aim or even the category that is being asserted? And so sometimes a kind of mismatch is what one finds there, that the very sort of styles of thinking are unable to actually attain the very goal that is set out or the standard that is being established. And I think that's probably the problem in some sense. That's why we see this term critical being kind of, imported into things like race studies, race and ethnic studies, because, there seems to be a need to now sort of figure out what is the proper approach that would lead to a kind of match with the standard that's being, Anyways, that sort of takes me far afield, but that's a way to maybe tie some of these ideas that are there in the chat or in the Q&A.
Just a very quick comment that I really like, just your discussion about a possible recuperative or redemptive methodology in philology. And I've similarly been thinking a lot about this in my field in anthropology. There's been a lot of work around, right, decolonizing the field, which is oftentimes used in a throwaway sort of way without pinning down what we actually mean by that. I do think it's useful to some extent, and a lot of work has been done around the canon, but I've been thinking more about what are the salient methodologies that we need if we had to rework a kind of graduate curriculum for anthro. And I really like Trio's point about we need to locate these places within the colonial discourse that offer a kind of re-entry. And so maybe that means locating these key definitive points of colonial violence and using them to sort of remap a key concept or a history or an epistemological framework that could have become more universalized but became domesticated or destroyed or exterminated or whatever it is. So maybe there's a way to have students do that in our departments as a kind of pedagogical exercise moving forward. And then the last point I wanted to make was, I think something that we maybe haven't done as well as Sikh Studies scholars is to work collaboratively across our methodologies and our training. And that is something I think that's potentially really fruitful for driving the field forward and to creating just a much more robust conversation, is if we pull together our expertise, our training, the kind of analysis that we're trained to do, and to be able to come up with some interesting ways to push the conversation forward. I'd love to see more of that. And I think in a way that speaks to the interdisciplinarity question that Connor was asking, like, are we interdisciplinary in name, or do we actually practice it? And then how do we practice it?
Seems like another bunch of questions have appeared.
Yeah, are there perhaps a couple questions that are calling out? Is there a question that's calling out to you? Perhaps as we wind down, we can answer 2 or 3.
I'll take a couple of these in groups. I've been looking at them. I think I will, of course, address them very, very briefly. I wish we had another hour or two. I want to acknowledge all these questions because they're really central to what we're talking about here, and they're great questions. I'm going to scroll all the way back up to Connor's question and tie this in with Parvinder Ji, good to see you, and Van Ji also. I think these questions can be taken as a group, at least in my thinking. So this question of Connor's, to what extent are we scholars of Sikh studies forming our own canon of people belonging to otherwise bounded post-Enlightenment disciplines. And this is of course, very central question. So we have to know the history of ideas that come from the post-Enlightenment period in order to be able to talk back to that. I think we can move past that, and it's not just Sikh studies who's engaged in this. It's a very minoritized thought formation, but there are many people who have been thinking about post-Enlightenment formation. So we can tie in with them, and we do have something unique to bring to that in the form of Sikh Chintan. Parvinder's question: is critical thought merely a ventriloquist's tool? I would say no. I think there are some valuable things about critical thought, but it's not an end in itself. That would be my very brief answer. Van's question is very important. I'll just take one of these. What constitutes a distinctive Sikh subject position? I think we need to resist that idea that there is a distinct Sikh subject position. I mean, the whole identity politics formation is what we need to question. I think what we're really dealing with here is a negative formation, that anything that appears that it might lead to a Sikh subject formation is immediately dismissed. And this is what we see in MacLeod's essay of Cries of Outrage, of course. Anything that appears to be a distinctive particular subject position is immediately dismissed. And I think we need to resist that. I think what we've all talked about here is the Sikh tradition is a multiplicity. There's no single singular Sikh tradition. Anonymous attendee and K. Singh both talked about engaging with youth and Sikh students groups. I mean, as educators, I think this is sort of the bottom line. We want to pass on something to the next generation, tools basically, that will, so they can carry it further than whatever we are able to do in our generation. Sangeeta's question, and I think Jaslene's question tied together, relationship between lived experience and critical thought, and Guru Nanak's dialogues and Sikh thought. Again, I would, I'm speaking for myself here, I would regard these resources like Siddh Ghosh. It's not, I wouldn't instrumentalize it and say it's just a tool against current formations or capitalism and so on and so forth. It can be used effectively like that, but there's of course much more to it. That's what I would, as a very brief answer, I think it's a much richer tradition than, again, to reiterate something I said before, it predates capitalism, liberalism, and the Enlightenment by several centuries. So it's not a reaction to those at all. It's pre all of those things. So we have to remember that and recognize that. So there are multiple dimensions in which it can be used, I think, and these resources can be used. Bobinderji's question, of course, we have to use critical thought to question these formations of inclusion and exclusion and citizenship. So that's one reason why we have to engage with critical thought, to deal with the existential conditions that we're living under. Francesca G's question, of course, music, I wish we had, like I said, another hour or two so we could really get into more detail. I would, obviously put that under the category of lived experience. Of course, it includes the Sikh Gurbani tradition as musical tradition as well. And I saw Randeep had a comment on the case for letting philology burn. Maybe he, but yeah. So, well, I wouldn't burn it, but I definitely would reclaim it, and it's just as much ours as it is anybody's. Doesn't belong to anyone. The study of texts should be open to various different ways of approaching them. So, all right. So.
That was the most beautiful run through as many Q&A questions. Very thoughtful. That was.
They're wonderful questions. I wanted to acknowledge them all. Yeah.
Never seen better in a conference all year. I wonder if you all have concluding thoughts, and then we do have a break. And just a reminder, you can absolutely keep the conversation going in the Q&A here. If you'd really like to give someone an answer, the Q&A will last. It will stay.
I just wanted to make a couple of comments too, just quick ones too. I think one of the questions that Van Dusenberry was asking that was connected to Punu's answer was the appropriate roles, responsibility, contributions of differently positioned interlocutors in the field of Sikh studies. I think that one of the good ways to have these conversations is to recognize how you're positioned and what those differences are and how you're multiply positioned, and kind of start the conversation with those things. I think there's a good way to have exchange and dialogue by recognizing the fragility of the ways that we position ourselves, but also the strengths that can come from that. So I think it's good to have that kind of worked into the conversation, is recognizing these different perspectives and how we're always multiply positioned and which positions we're choosing when we're having a conversation that should be enunciated to kind of further the dialogue and help kind of the conversation going on. I think Bal's question is really good. I think, the question of power, and especially in relation to the Khalsa, there's a question there that's really provocative in the sense of, there's also multiple ideas of the Khalsa right now, and those being debated. We can see those being debated even in the farmers' protest. Often the people who are representatives of the Dal Khalsa or the Dal Khalsa Panth, the Jathas, the armies of Akal Purkh ki Fauj, they seem pretty aloof to these ideas and structures of power that exist in the temporal world. They say that, their Raj comes from Akal Purkh and they're already independent and sovereign. Then there's other people who appropriate Khalsa identity in different ways and are actively struggling for some type of political power that exists in a geopolitical space. And there's people in the diaspora who I think would use Khalsa as a different way of privileging sovereignty in relation to other minority or allyships and things like that. So I think that's a good conversation. And again, like Pun was saying, we could talk about that for a long time. Just a comment about the youth engagement. I think everyone on the panel has been doing youth engagement. At University of Michigan, we would reach out to Sangats, invite youth into summer courses with us. I know Anneeth is working with activist groups in California. In Alberta, we're also doing the same thing with groups that are positioned here in different ways across the country. So I think that's what's going on, and that's something that's really important to all of us, and a part of the critical thinking project that we're kind of committing to.
Yeah, and just on that last point, I think that we have to acknowledge the ongoing existing work with community groups and not necessarily position the community as a threat or necessarily constantly opposed to academics either. And I hope that can be something that we continue to complicate in this conversation. I think that staking out the political positions and how we are working through them across communities, the university, and within Sikh Studies is important. And there's a multiplicity of positions, and it's actually healthy that we have different perspectives on different things, and we think about things in different ways, and we're not all unified, and that allows us actually to be healthy as a field and moving forward to continue having really robust conversations.
A quick request to Adam, would you be able to, either you or Gurbir, would you be able to collect these questions and send them to us so that we can incorporate some answers when we write up the papers?
Absolutely. The session will stay open. We'll see if we can, if we have to, we'll copy paste them all. We'll look into that.
Yeah, we can copy and paste. I'll just go ahead and do that. And I'll just email it to you right now, Dr. Mandair. I'll do it right away.
We do have to break, give people a chance to break because the evening session begins at 4:30. So in 5 minutes. Dr. Fennick, I've seen your hand open. I'm afraid we'll have to wait for your address tonight. Otherwise, I'd love to open your mic up. So we will take a 5-minute break. Thank you to everyone. What a wonderful discussion.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Guriqbal, Gurbir, Jasbir Singh.
Thanks, everyone. Great questions.
Everyone.